that you need to work on or are triggered by. You can kind of swap that one around. My writing is really messy.
Great. Let's see how we go with this. Okay. Right. Welcome, everyone. So the check-in question for today is, if you reach down into your tummy, what are you aware of that you feel you really need to work on? And sort of in parallel with that, what do you know about yourself and the things that trigger you? Does everybody understand what I mean by trigger? The things that really just, you're suddenly out of control, exploding, and you're not even sure why. So we'll just give you a minute to maybe think about that.
Maybe so that can start.
I heard that. This is really relevant because I've been triggered by this a lot in the past kind of few days. And it goes back to something that I'd recognized in myself and I felt like I'd worked through in my own, I guess, behavior. And now that I feel like I've done some of that work, you never fully complete the work. It's really like flashing lights for me and others. And it has to do with my default, which is towards practical action, and getting frustrated when people around me go for more words rather than less, really like have to continually do whole expositions and sort of like full on, I don't know, like almost like passionate diatribes about subjects over and over and over again to help them make sense of it, where I'm just sitting here in the background going, we've done this already, can we just get to work? So I need to find more compassion and patience and time within myself to let that work happen. Because it's hard. That's me.
Thank you, Susan. Would you like to nominate the next person?
Tom's been smiling, so I'm going to go with Tom.
Can everybody hear me? Awesome. So I would say something that I am working on / is triggering is when someone default replies making like a ton of assumptions or doesn't read the documentation is very triggering to me. So for example, if like someone asks for help and you send them on, oh, I think this would be like really helpful. This article might help you out, and they refuse to read it or they refuse to engage. I think that's part of the educator in me. It's really hard when people don't engage, and much harder in a remote environment when you can't be like right next to them and making sure that like, okay, are you actively learning? That gets really hard. So I have to adapt to the environment that we're in to be able to make that, make whatever information I'm giving people more approachable so that they can engage with it.
That's awesome, Tom. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Madeline.
So I was going to say what Susan said, but I will say something else instead. I feel quite triggered by and struggle to remain calm when people say they believe in equality in the workplace, but the reason there aren't any females in certain professions or high levels is because there aren't enough good females. I'm like, you can't actually believe both of those things are true at once. So you either believe women are inherently less capable, or you believe that, perhaps they should have 50% representation. So I'll leave it there, or I'll start getting very ranty.
Thanks, Madeline. Who would like to go next? Frank.
Frank.
Yep. So one thing I find a little triggering is when people try to tell me what to do or what they think they know what's best for me. And I feel like this is something that could be a problem when someone is trying to ask for help. If they don't phrase it in the right way, I feel like it's like they're asking me to do their work for them rather than asking for my assistance. And so I know that's something I could probably work on.
Thanks, Frank. So who haven't we heard from? Who'd like to go next? Akila. Sorry, Horatio. You next. Akila, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so something I find really triggering is really, really stubborn people. My grandma is pretty stubborn, so it's something I dealt with my whole life, basically. But I actually dealt with that recently with a coworker, and I never dealt with that before in a work environment. And I just find it like really frustrating when someone's stubborn and thinks that a certain way is right, and I just tend to disengage because I'm a pretty calm person, and I like when I know someone's like heated or like gonna escalate, I just disengage. Like I can't interact with someone like that, or someone who reacts that way, or when someone reacts that way. So I guess that's something I could work on.
Thanks, Akila. Horatio.
So what triggers me is when, for example, when people reach out for a solution, an easy solution, without even thinking whether it's without even stopping to think whether that solution is still right. Lack of self-examination, maybe you could call it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Horatio. Who else have we got? Brianna.
One of the things that's been a trigger of mine is kind of a combination of a couple of things that kind of Tom said and Susan said around just kind of having to repeat and cover old ground again and again with people who aren't necessarily listening, aren't reading the right information, and having to come back again and again. And I think I probably need to realize that my ways of communication might not be the way that everybody else likes to communicate and absorb information, so I have to be a bit more patient and not get too frustrated by having to cover ground multiple times.
Great, thank you, Brianna. So we've still got Eileen, Kelvin.
I was just going to say the same thing. I guess I get triggered when I have to repeat myself. And I think my assumption is that people aren't listening like deeply, but, you know, it might not necessarily be the case. And I think I just have to be more understanding or forgiving in that sense. I guess it all depends on the situation.
Some common themes there. Thanks, Eileen. So we've got Jenny and then Kelvin.
One thing that was triggering for me was the violent politeness article, because I felt like, oh shoot, that's me. So I guess like trying to get more comfortable with that would be something to work on. Yeah.
We'll tell Lisa who wrote it.
I think it triggered many of us, Jenny. Thank you. Kelvin.
I think my trigger is quite funny. If I realize you're not listening to me, I'm just going to let you slip away and do your own thing. So maybe I should stop doing that. Maybe I should be more patient and explain myself differently in a way that you might understand and not let you do things. Well, basically, I just watch people sort of do things wrongly or incorrectly, and I let them do it sometimes, only because it's sort of like, hey, if you're not listening, fine. Maybe, I need to work on that.
Great, thanks, Kelvin. So have we had everybody? Except you and Kate. Kate, what's your trigger?
Oh, I've got a few. One is similar to Susan, like we always coin words in our work and Inspire. And one terrible one I coined was frother. So like a frother is like frothed up milk in a coffee. So if someone's frothy and they're like frothy milk, and what that means is they're all excited and energized and they're like frothy milk, and then like they just never deliver. So we have this joke, like the frothier the person is, the less like the likelihood of action and delivery. And I'm like super triggered by that, like someone talking a big game and then like no action points, just walking away and letting things fall through. Yeah. And I'm also really triggered when I like I can go with that. I feel like, a decision that I've expressly said, I really care about the outcome of this. This is like super important to me. This is my opinion, and I'm not they don't take my advice. I still find that triggering. So, yep, there's a couple.
Yeah, there's a couple.
And I think like with that later thing,
there are more.
No, I'm going on to the action now. There's like when someone doesn't like deliver in the way that I kind of expect that they should, there's actually quite a lot of stuff you can do in trying to figure out what kind of personality type they are, because I'm like a different personality type, obviously, and my standard is not like the one that we should all live by, and perhaps they're adding value in another way. So yeah. And the second one,
Tom wants to know what the opposite of a frother is.
it's a long black coffee with no milk.
Sharp and to the point.
No frothy milk. No cappuccinos. Okay. Mary?
Yeah, my trigger is an easy one. I get really triggered when I see people bullying other people, and bullying comes in all shapes and sizes. Like it could be those sort of microaggressions or that really sort of forceful coercive behavior. And interestingly, I get more triggered when I witness bullying rather than when the bullying is like done to me, which is also kind of cool. And yeah, I know where it comes from. I was raised by Catholic nuns. It's definitely a trigger for me. And so, yeah, how do I combat it? I really sort of dig deep into the place that kind of empathy and go, well, look, something has created this horrendous behavior. And so I sort of leave a little bit of room for compassion and curiosity about why people are driven to behave like that. So I don't write them off totally. But yeah, that's definitely my standout number one.
Okay, well, that was a good place to conclude us, because that is, all of these triggers come from somewhere, right? Like something that happened to us, when we were young or as a teenager, and we're often reacting really strongly because we had this experience happen to us. So we do actually need to keep asking, like, why does this trigger me so much? What is it that's actually going on underneath the surface? And often we do project the fault onto someone else, but it's actually most of the time when we are like super, maybe not triggered, but super like, often interpersonal conflict actually comes because the actions, or there's some part of the other person that we can see ourselves in. And so it's actually much more complicated than just kind of blaming and kind of letting conflict or just not getting along become this thing that's out there with them. We actually really always have to interrogate what's going on. Where does this come from with me? What is one action point I can start with to deflate this kind of, when you get triggered, the Buddhists call it the shengpa. It's just like you get totally hooked, and you are like, once you get that hooked feeling, it's very hard to let go. And that's kind of the origin of where conflict comes from. Horatio, I just thought I'd put that in there for you, the Buddhism. So this week, we are just going to share the slides. Do you want to share the slides with us?
Where did you put them?
Maybe Mary can.
I can share the slides.
We're just going to start doing a little bit of looking back, just to understand where we've got to before we start digging into the content. Yeah, next one.
Okay, next one.
So we'll just reflect a little bit before we continue. So we started in week 1 with just like a really deep dive into self-organization, what it means. There was a lot of stuff in that week, including roles, accountability, and commitments. We made social contracts. We talked a lot. That week was really quite big in terms of setting us up. When we started this training, that was actually week 5 was week 1. So we started with the self and self-organization, and then accountability and commitments was at the end. But we decided that just for where Consensus 2.0 was at, we thought that week 1 should actually be really providing a bit better framing and focusing in on this key word of accountability. So week 2, we really went into a bit more theory around the adult-to-adult partnership paradigm, and listening and communication culture, with a bit of slight looking into nonviolent communication. Week 3, we talked about decision making across many different processes, and we did, for the first time, we really went into some more of the what's happening at the individual level when we make decisions, which was because of Mary, which was really good. There was some really good assignments that came through that week, and if you haven't seen the assignments, please do go into the individual assignments folder and have a look in there. Week 4 was really interesting. We had John on from Inspire, the kind of premise was that how can we start to pull out an experimental mindset. So we just had John on, and we focused the content on some experiments that we ran in Inspire to suit our context. And that was really good, because that seemed to help you pull up kind of the things that were really needed or pressing for this to start to work at a broader scale at Consensus. And now we have come full circle to week 5, which is looking into how the self and self-organization. So if you remember, we kind of had this, I don't think it's there actually. Well, you can go down. The ecosystem level of how self-organization and self-management needs to happen. So that's like the Consensus mesh-wide. Like, what are the agreements? What is the broad culture that's going to hold us in place? And then we have the kind of team level, which many of the assignments and many of the discussions have been about. How does this kind of new approach to working affect how we operate in a team? How can we be just as efficient and more productive and more happier at our team level, and by utilizing some of these tools, practices, and principles? And now we're kind of really trying to focus in on what is important for the individual in terms of this thing called self-organization. Because, can you actually go to that side?
Okay.
I'm a bit disorganized with my slides today. But if you think about it, like, we really do need to focus in on how we are at work if we're going to just start getting rid of, how we've been working for the last couple of 100 years. We're really doing a paradigm shift. And so it's been quite obvious to Susan and I, as we've worked with many organizations, that just saying, okay, here are all the tools and processes, just use these to reorganize how you work and you'll be fine, is not quite enough. People themselves kind of need to go through a bit of a self-development, a bit of a questioning of, if we think about the old system, what some of the behaviors that get rewarded in that system are. Those behaviors can't be rewarded in this new system because it's just not sustainable. I think we've, in the reading this week, tried to articulate some of the stuff that the individual should kind of do. So that's kind of understanding your personal mission, your values, how you best work and openly communicate, committing to understand, interrogating, and working on your triggers and your ego states, committing to showing up with your whole self. But what else? And that's going to be a bit of a discussion for today. So I don't think we actually need to do that. Do we just want to stop sharing the screen and have a little bit of a discussion before we go? We're going to do a 1, 2, 4 all after this. So what's coming up for people around hi Brett? We've just done a check-in and now we're talking about a bit of the content. We just did a bit of a cast back on where we've got to in this training so far and the importance of bringing it into the kind of self level. So I had a bit of a list there. What else is important when we start to think about the individual or the self level in self-organization? What was anything coming up for you as you did the readings? Maybe I can ask a more pointed.
I can answer.
Go ahead.
So last week there was a conflict with, sorry, Pegasus people, but someone on my team was just being like super stubborn. And they had this idea that like their way was right, but like they weren't listening to the voice of reason, and it got to the point where like a lot of people got annoyed. So as I was reading the reading with like self awareness, I was like, wow, this would be really helpful for this cohort. Which I thought was really funny. So my team is actually really interested in like learning what we're learning, or like they want me to like debrief what we learned on in this class. So I think it'd be really interesting to like bring that up with my team. And I think it's definitely something that we have to do, because last week we just like had so much work piled on that everyone got overwhelmed, and I think it just like pulled out like the worst of like our personalities. So it was really hectic, but I think it's better.
Okay, well that is it's an interesting reflection. And I really want to keep calling attention to that notion of like there's this conflict happening out there, and also how being self-aware about ourselves and compassionate. And I'll pass to you in a second, Brett. The onion for this week, I won't share the screen, but the tools that we've included in the content is 5 whys, which is you'll understand more about in the individual assignment. Nonviolent communication, which I invite you all to explore more. It's super helpful. The practice that we'll be doing is feedback in pairs. So all of you will be giving some feedback to everyone else and be getting feedback from everyone else. The principle is alignment of values and mission with yourself, and also integration and empathy. And the mindset is going down into the belly, feeling your feelings, being radically honest with yourself, and being self-compassionate. So I think some of those things can also be applied when we're seeing others having conflict as well. And Brett, I wanted to pass to you what was coming up.
Sorry, me, right? Okay, thanks. So I think something outside of the readings, but I shared a bunch of text in the SO101-4 Slack channel. I apologize for all that text, but I was making my way through the Reinventing Organizations book, and I thought there was this section of just like shared cultural values. I think that I thought was really just relevant to what we're talking about this week, but also just very thought-provoking. And, for example, one of the things that is said in Self and Caring Workspaces, any situation can be appeared from fear and separation or from love and connection. We choose love and connection. And I was just wondering, like, are these values something that we make explicit at Consensus, whether we'll have a better just shared understanding and approach to interacting with each other and how to approach self-organization. So I thought that was really interesting. And it goes on, there's like a huge list, but
yeah. Great. I didn't have time to read it, but I'm going to go back and try to pick up on some of the key points there.
I mean, I have a little reaction on to that. I think yes, and I'm just thinking about the humans of Consensus, that for whom that notion has never occurred, right? And for whom maybe has never been invited to practice in that way. And just this overarching question that I have is just there's power in intention, but there's also probably more power in practice. So I'm not sure if I just talked in a loop there, but that's like what was coming up for me when you were sharing that, Brett.
It was a bit like too, I don't know if people can prescribe values for you. Like we in our small teams have defined values, but we've all been involved in that. Consensus is so big. So if people people say these are our values, but we didn't necessarily sign up, like how do you get people to buy into that?
I love what you said, Jenny. That power of intention sounds frothy. It totally sounds frothy. But I think that I say it, hopefully for me, in a non-frothy way, because like a number of times I've like set intentions and not having any idea how I could possibly make that happen. But setting the intention has somehow made me either more aware of the possibilities or more attuned to the possibilities that have actually got me there. So it's a big question, right? How do we, Peter Block says this thing about, in order to actually raise our potential, we also have to raise the quality of our language. But how do we do that without sounding frothy? I don't know.
Frothiness is fine as long as there's follow through. Okay.
Frothiness and action.
Yeah, frothiness and action. Okay. So a little bit of what we've been practicing in this training, in the check-ins and some of these conversations, is this notion which, yeah, it sounds a bit, I don't know, I don't really like it sometimes, but bringing the whole self to work, which it's kind of like, how can we show up as, and not have to put on a mask and not have to pretend to be something we're not, and not have to act in order to appear trustworthy. I can always give a whole lot of work to Kate because I know that she'll always deliver, even if, inside I'm like falling apart. I want to, in a kind of hierarchical system, I would show up and be like, I'm always this person. So in a self-organizing system, we kind of try to do things a bit differently, which just is to say that if one day I turn up and I'm like, Susan, I'm not functioning well today, like this is just how I am right now, we can use that to actually prioritize in a different way. And Susan, I want to invite you to share a little bit on what this means for you before we go into the 1, 2, 4 all.
Thanks. I mean, for me, it is, and I understand, well, I know you well enough to know why you kind of go back and forth between it, because you're so good at keeping boundaries. But for me, it's not really about boundaries. It's about, in traditional organizations, the perspective that's valued around problem solving and getting shit done is that really rational stroke masculine perspective of doing things. And what Lulu says is that when we're only focused on bringing that one little component of our personalities, we're missing out on, I don't know, another dozen aspects of who we are as lenses or postures from which to do our work or solve problems or have new opinions or new lenses on stuff that we can create together. So for me, it's about how do we expand our willingness to bring maybe our more emotional parts or our more creative parts. And part of that obviously is something that can come out in check-ins, right? As I love, Kate, your description of that is, if I'm coming into a work session with you, for example, and you share that you had a really bad night's sleep or that you're distracted by something else, I can actually moderate my expectation and help to support you in different ways than I would if you just came and sat down, with your buttoned up shirt on and said, I'm here to work. So for me, it's about not necessarily, and this is a question that I get all the time, is like, I don't want to have to deal with all of the emotional baggage and BS of my colleagues. But that's not really what it's about. It's about being more honest with your state to help the entire team function better.
Yeah, and we're going to dig into this notion of bringing your whole self and about having boundaries as well. And I don't mean boundaries about sharing or boundaries about stopping other people sharing. I more mean boundaries around, okay, I can't get up for more than a couple of days in a week to have a 7 a.m. call. Like the one I missed this morning. It's just like, I know that if I cross that line too many times, I'm going to be sick. I'll get sick. Or I have a boundary around, there's a lot around time and work, doing calls and international. So, and I'm just like really firm about that because of my own. And so I'm interested in exploring this question of bringing whole self to work and also having boundaries. And I want to know if you wanted to say anything there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting, I guess I hadn't really had any experience or practice with any of this, starting with check-ins and then sort of really listening to what people were saying in the check-in before I joined the Lumio team about 5-6 years ago. And one of the things I really, really noticed that we did incredibly well, and we still do to a degree, but we probably don't practice it as much because the team members have shifted around, is just how powerful it is when you choose to share your vulnerability or, that moment of you in time, which might not be operating at your most dynamic self or your happiest self or your most energetic self. And what I noticed immediately was how we would sort of collect around each other and support. And so, even when other team members' check-ins might not have been explicitly offering any support, that sort of, it suddenly comes and is made available as soon as, members of the team highlight that they're having a bad day or whatever. And so it's that dynamic shifting roles and holding space for each other, which I just found the more we practiced it as a team at Lumio, the better and better we got at it. And it's really powerful. Like you've such a strong sense of being a part of a team when you feel genuinely without expectations that other people really have your back, that they genuinely care about you.
Okay, so let's go and discuss these in smaller groups. We're going to do a 1, 2, 4 all to discuss this question. Discuss bringing the whole self and maintaining your boundaries. That's what we're going to be talking about in the 1, 2, 4 all. So what does that mean for you? So we'll start off a minute on your own. I'm going to write this in the chat. And whatever comes up in the pairs, and also when you go into your fours, just be conscious to notice the patterns in order to share back when we come all back together. So thinking for a moment for 1 minute, and Susan, can you do the timing?
Yeah.
Bringing your whole self and maintaining boundaries, and whatever that means for you. We just want to dig into this a little bit more and then enable you to do this in smaller groups. A minute starting now.
Okay, you ready? I'm gonna break you out into pairs and then give you how long in pairs? 2 minutes in pairs, and then I'll join you to another group. Yeah. There'll be one group of 4 and one group of 6, just because that's how we are today.